ding of my phone sounded like a hammer hitting glass. I froze, coffee halfway to my lips. The message stared back at me. Go die already. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I blinked, certain my eyes were deceiving me. My own son. Dylan **** had typed that. No emojis, no context, just pure venom. My chest tightened, and the kitchen felt suddenly too small. The hum of the fridge, the faint whir of the AC vent, even the ticking of the wall clock, all of it became unbearable white noise. I dropped my mug. Coffee spread across the countertop, dark and sticky, like the knot forming in my stomach. How had it come to this? We were supposed to be family. We were supposed to have each other's backs. And yet here I was, staring at words that cut deeper than any blade. 2 minutes later, I sat on the edge of my worn dining chair, staring at the spilled coffee, listening to the hum of Denver traffic outside. I could feel the anger simmering, but more than that, there was a raw, sharp clarity. Something had to change. The words weren't just rude, they were a boundary shattered, a line I never thought I'd have to draw. And yet, that line was now glowing in neon across my life. I could remember the moment I first started believing in letting Dylan figure it out. I thought stepping back would protect us both. But what did protection matter if it left me standing in ruins? I rubbed my temples, trying to think. He was living in my house rent-free, freelancing in photography, and somehow thought that gave him the right to speak to me like that. That conversation from last night, about bills, the business, my savings, had escalated fast. I hadn't even seen this coming. I pressed my palms to my eyes. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. The ding of another message pulled me out of my spiral. This time it was from the bank. A routine alert, but in my mind it felt like a warning. The timer was ticking. Everything I'd built over decades could slip through my fingers if I didn't act. And for the first time I realized this wasn't about anger, it was about survival. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning light on my face from the kitchen window. The city was waking up, oblivious to the family storm raging in my little home. I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore Dylan's words. Not anymore. And that was the moment I decided I would act. Lawfully, carefully, without leaving a scratch I couldn't clean. I sank deeper into the worn leather of my recliner, the sunlight bouncing off the Denver skyline outside my window, and tried to process it all. The air smelled faintly of burnt toast and morning coffee, remnants of a breakfast I hadn't finished. My thoughts kept circling back to that text. Go die already. The words felt like they had been hammered into my chest. I've always believed that giving Dylan space, letting him stumble, letting him figure out life on his own was the safest path. My parents taught me the same. Step back. Don't make waves. Don't burn bridges. And for years, that's how I ran my life, how I ran my business, how I parented. Keep the peace, they said. Avoid confrontation. But peace, I was learning, was a fragile illusion. The house felt too quiet now, every creak of the floorboards reminding me of how alone I really was in this fight. Even the neighborhood was serene, with joggers and dog walkers moving down the sidewalks, oblivious to the storm inside my kitchen. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, bitter like the truth I was swallowing. My misbelief had left me vulnerable. I thought about Dylan, 30 years old but still somehow acting like a child. A struggling freelance photographer who'd moved back in after a series of short-term gigs failed. I had opened my home, my wallet, my trust, and he had spat back venom. Why did I think avoiding boundaries would protect our bond? Instead, it had enabled this disrespect. The AC hum mixed with the faint traffic noise outside as I ran my hands through my graying hair. I felt my pulse in my temples. I had always measured life in contracts, invoices, ledgers, business plans. Logic kept me grounded, but emotions had a way of sneaking in, uninvited. And right now, the lesson was painfully clear. Logic alone didn't protect you from personal betrayal. I leaned back and let my mind wander through the past year. The missed deadlines, the unpaid bills, the nights I spent balancing the books while Dylan claimed he needed inspiration for some photography project. Always excuses, never results. And now, he had crossed a line I didn't know could be crossed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades building a small business, a neighborhood print shop that had survived recessions, rising rents, and late-paying clients. And here I was, feeling powerless in my own home. All because I had believed peace and leniency would shield me from family strife. I shook my head. My misbelief wasn't just about letting Dylan slide. It was about me refusing to see reality. Life had rules. Contracts had rules. Boundaries had rules. And I'd ignored them in the hope that love alone would suffice. That's when I realized I wasn't just angry. I was clarifying a boundary I had let dissolve over time. This wasn't a petty fight. It was about safeguarding decades of work, savings, and dignity. And to do that, I couldn't rely on hope or niceness anymore. I needed a plan. A lawful, airtight plan that would ensure Dylan could never treat me or my assets this way again. I glanced at the stack of mail by the kitchen counter, the checkbook, the ledger of overdue invoices for my small business clients, and a folder with lease agreements for rental properties I managed. Each object seemed to whisper the same thing: rules matter. Documentation matters. Action matters. Asterisk asterisk. I knew I couldn't undo the insult. I couldn't erase the words. But I could set the terms going forward. And for the first time, I understood that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was preservation. It was protection. And yes, it could be executed in a lawful, methodical way. I drew in a long, slow breath and let it out, feeling the Denver morning sun warming my face. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. But the truth didn't start that morning. It started months earlier when Dylan first moved back in, when small signs of entitlement began to surface, and when I unknowingly set the stage for this confrontation. It all began about a year ago, on a brisk March morning in Denver. Dylan had called me in a panic, voice jittery over the crackle of his old cell phone. His apartment lease in Lodo had ended, his freelance gigs weren't paying, and he had nowhere to go. My first instinct, of course, was to help. I'd been a small business owner for decades, and I knew how quickly life could spiral. I remember driving him to my house, past the I-25 overpasses and the early morning traffic jams, the city slowly waking up around us. Dylan's duffel bag sat in the passenger seat, the smell of cheap cologne mixing with leftover coffee from his long night. I thought, asterisk, he needs a safety net. I can give that. Asterisk, I never considered that the safety net might become a noose. Moving back in seemed simple at first. I rearranged the guest room, bought a new mattress, and even invested in a small studio setup for his photography. Lighting stands, a decent Canon DSLR, backdrops, all totaling nearly $2 for $100. He was grateful, at least on the surface. But the signs of trouble started quickly. Late nights with no work, unpaid personal debts stacking up, calls from clients he'd promised photos to months ago. And somehow, my goodwill became an expectation rather than a privilege. I ran a tight ship at my print shop downtown, a modest operation on South Broadway. My days were spent juggling invoices, supplier payments, and payroll, often from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. I prided myself on being fair, meticulous, and careful with money. But home was different, or so I thought. I assumed love and trust would smooth over any financial irresponsibility. One evening, over microwaved leftover chili at our small kitchen table, I handed Dylan a spreadsheet. It was a simple budget I'd drawn up. Bills due, rent contributions, savings targets. Dylan, I want you to start contributing, I said. His face tightened. I've got my own style, Dad. I'll figure it out. I smiled, nodding, believing my patience would teach him responsibility. That patience, as I'd learn, was mistaken leniency. Weeks passed and the tension grew. I had bills of my own, mortgage payments on my suburban Capitol Hill home, the insurance premium for the shop, healthcare expenses for my aging parents who lived nearby. Each time I reminded Dylan of responsibilities, he sighed, made excuses, or walked away. I noticed the subtle changes, the way he avoided eye contact when talking about money, the sharpness in his tone when I corrected him. Then came the holiday season. I took him to my bank, hoping to help him set up a savings account and track expenses. The banker, Mrs. Calder, was a cheerful woman in her 50s who knew my family for years. She smiled politely as Dylan brushed her off, muttering something about instant transfers being too slow. Later, I learned she had quietly noted my concerns, a small detail that would later become a pivot point. I also started noticing minor irritations that should have been red flags. The lease for my rental property in Cherry Creek, an apartment Dylan had once flirted with, had a clause about tenants paying late fees immediately if rent was overdue. Dylan laughed it off when I brought it up casually. "You'll never make me pay that," he said. At the time, I laughed along, thinking it harmless teenage-like bravado from a 30-year-old man who should have known better. Family events added another layer. My sister, Linda, lived just 10 miles away, and she loved having Dylan over. But every time he visited, he complained about food, the house temperature, or chores. I found myself walking on eggshells during holidays, letting him slip through boundaries I normally enforced with clients, suppliers, and employees. I thought I was being patient, nurturing, compassionate, but in reality, I was enabling. And then there was the email thread I had ignored. Months before the text, Dylan had asked me to co-sign for a camera loan, promising he'd pay me back by the end of the month. I didn't read the fine print, assuming trust would be enough. The first installment bounced. Then the second. By December, I had a folder of unpaid invoices, messages, and receipts tucked in my office drawer. A quiet archive of entitlement building into confrontation. These documents, overlooked at first, would become critical pieces of evidence later. So when that text came, the one that said, "Go die already," it didn't land out of nowhere. It landed on a foundation I had unknowingly built for him. Indulgence, permissiveness, and my own misbelief that keeping peace was safer than enforcing rules. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. By mid-January, the shock of Dylan's message had faded, replaced by a cold clarity. I couldn't pretend anymore. My misbelief that avoiding conflict protected us had failed spectacularly. I needed a plan, and it had to be legal, methodical, and airtight. No drama, no threats, no loopholes he could exploit. I started by pulling out the folder I'd been compiling since December. Unpaid camera loan invoices, text threads promising contributions toward rent, and notes from my business ledger showing every dollar I had spent covering his mistakes. Each document was a quiet hammer, reminding me that facts and evidence were on my side. Step 1. Establish boundaries in writing. I drafted a certified letter, outlining clear terms for living in my house. Rent due on the 1st, utilities shared, contributions toward groceries, and, most importantly, consequences for failure to comply. I even referenced the lease clause from my Cherry Creek property, something Dylan had mocked months ago. Sending it certified ensured there was an official record. Step 2. Small claims research. I visited the Denver County Clerk's office one cold afternoon, the sun bouncing off the nearby 16th Street Mall, tourists oblivious to my storm. I filled out forms, checked filing deadlines, and asked questions about documenting unpaid debts. The clerk, a quiet man with thick glasses, walked me through the process. It was meticulous work, but it felt empowering. I could see a path forward. Step 3. Tighten control of shared resources. I scheduled appointments with my bank to confirm account access and update authorizations. I met with Mrs. Calder, the banker who had seen Dylan's casual disregard before, and explained my plan. She quietly offered advice about documenting interactions and maintaining clear paper trails. A wild card I hadn't expected, but one I would leverage carefully. I set a timer in my head. By the end of February, all notices would be delivered, filings in motion, and responsibilities clearly defined. If Dylan balked or tried to manipulate the process, I would have legal and financial safeguards in place. No theatrics, just rules enforced. The promise of revenge wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoring order, protecting my legacy, and making it impossible for Dylan to disregard my boundaries again. I envisioned a future where I could walk into my home without tension, where my business could operate without his distractions, and where my decades of work weren't leveraged against me. But the setup required finesse. I couldn't let him catch wind too early. If he realized I was building a case, he might remove assets, hide documents, or manipulate witnesses. So every step was discreet. Certified letters sent under pretense of routine billing, meetings scheduled during his freelance photo shoots, and small claims research done while he was out. I also enlisted an ally, my longtime assistant, Rachel, who managed my shop's day-to-day operations. She understood boundaries and respected the law as much as I did. I explained the situation carefully, emphasizing discretion. She agreed to log any unusual interactions Dylan had with the business or household accounts. Her notes would later serve as a neutral witness record. Every morning, I rehearsed the plan in my mind while brewing coffee in my favorite stovetop espresso maker, the scent rich and grounding. I visualized the process step by step. Notices delivered, deadlines met, documentation logged, small claims filed, and boundaries enforced. I imagined Dylan's frustration, yes, but more importantly, I imagined the calm certainty of walking through my door knowing the rules were finally respected. And then came the first complication, a subtle one. Dylan's girlfriend, unaware of the legal preparations, mentioned casually at a dinner party that I was strict about rules now. My stomach tightened. Could she expose my plan prematurely? That would give Dylan time to circumvent it. I reminded myself to tighten discretion further. This was the promise of revenge. Methodical, legal, inevitable. Not emotional retribution, not cruelty, but restoration of order. I had learned the hard way that love without boundaries leaves chaos in its wake. Dylan would have to confront reality, and I would finally have the upper hand, safely and lawfully. Then the pushback started. February arrived with sharp winds that rattled the windows of my Denver home, echoing the tension in the air. I had sent the certified letters, updated bank authorizations, and organized all my documentation. For a moment, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The plan was in motion, boundaries clear, and legal safeguards in place. But life, of course, enjoys testing even the best-laid plans. First came the lawyer letter. Dylan, predictably, had sought legal advice. A thin envelope arrived with the crisp click of the mailbox hinge. I opened it carefully. Vague threats about overreach and unfair claims. References to some obscure tenant rights clause. It was enough to make a lay person hesitate, but I had done my homework. I compared every line to the lease and my small claims preparation. Nothing in the letter undermined the legal steps I had taken. Still, the pushback stung. My pulse quickened, and the old frustration bubbled up. Then the near exposure. Dylan's girlfriend, unaware of the details, posted about Dad cracking down on social media. A mutual friend noticed, commenting about it in a group chat I had access to for business purposes. If Dylan saw that chatter, he could have anticipated my moves and tried to remove assets or manipulate evidence. I immediately instructed Rachel to monitor any online mentions discreetly. Every notification became a potential clue, every comment a possible trigger. Meanwhile, practical complications mounted. One of my rental properties had an unexpected plumbing issue, leading to a city inspection. That meant coordinating repairs while keeping the Dylan situation under wraps. I found myself juggling contractors, city inspectors, and my small business clients simultaneously. I kept a ledger of every call, receipt, and date. It was exhausting but necessary. One slip, and my carefully documented timeline could unravel. Through it all, I noticed Dylan's subtle defiance. Small things, leaving dishes piled in the kitchen, late-night social media scrolling while avoiding conversation, half-hearted promises about contributing to bills, were little sparks of resistance. Each one was a reminder that the stakes weren't just financial. They were emotional. My authority in my own home, the respect I deserved, was being tested continuously. Then came the mini reveal. A message from Dylan that arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening. He admitted, almost offhand, to missing a photography contract deadline because he forgot about an opportunity. That single line was illuminating. His aggression, the go-die already outburst, was less about me personally and more about his own fear of failure. His resentment masked insecurity. That insight reframed my understanding. This wasn't pure malice. It was a twisted reaction to personal shortcomings. The complications, while frustrating, had a silver lining. Each obstacle forced me to tighten procedures. More precise certified letters, double-checked bank authorizations, and even a subtle log of interactions with neighbors and community members who might unknowingly become witnesses. My attention to detail became a shield. By mid-February, I realized the situation was no longer just about enforcing rules. It was a test of endurance, patience, and strategic thinking. Every pushback Dylan threw my way forced me to reevaluate the problem and reframe the plan. No longer was it enough to set rules. I had to anticipate resistance, adapt quickly, and protect every piece of my life that mattered. And that's when I had a critical insight. That's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. Dylan's behavior wasn't the main challenge. The challenge was my own approach. Passive tolerance and misbelief that avoiding confrontation would maintain peace. That mindset had created the perfect storm. Changing it, and backing it with lawful, meticulous action, was the true path forward. With that clarity, I began preparing for the pivot. A reframing of goals, an upgrade of strategy, and a public stance that would be undeniable. By late February, the pushback had become predictable. Dylan's small defiance, the lawyer letters, and the near exposure from his girlfriend were no longer surprises. They were data points. And as I sat in my home office overlooking the snow-dusted Denver streets, sipping my now-cold coffee, I realized something important. The problem wasn't just Dylan. It was me. For years, I had avoided confrontation, believing that giving him space would protect our relationship. I had let hope and leniency guide my decisions, thinking patience equaled peace. But patience without enforcement is useless. It's like giving a map to a treasure and leaving the gates unlocked. Dylan had tested every boundary, pushed every limit, and I had allowed it. That's when the shift happened. I reframed my goal. I wasn't just setting rules. I was reclaiming my life. I wasn't seeking revenge and anger. I was restoring order, establishing boundaries, and ensuring that my decades of work and my hard-earned savings were protected. The public stance moment came one chilly Thursday evening. Dylan was lounging in the living room, headphones in, scrolling through his phone. I walked in with a stack of papers, the certified letters, invoices, lease agreements, and a small claims filing checklist. I set them on the coffee table with deliberate calm. "Dylan," I said, voice steady, "these are the terms. You're either on board, or you'll need to face the consequences." His eyes flicked up, confusion and irritation mingling. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply stated the rules. Boundaries were no longer whispers or implied expectations. They were concrete, documented, and legally enforceable. And for the first time, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I also updated my strategy to include all contingencies. Any attempts by Dylan to move assets, manipulate documentation, or create delays would now trigger immediate lawful action. Small claims filings, bank notifications, and contract enforcement. I refined the timeline, ensuring every step had proof of delivery, confirmation receipts, and backup copies stored both physically and digitally. Every action was deliberate, measured, and verifiable. The reframing pivot was reinforced by Rachel, my assistant. She had begun logging interactions meticulously, noting times, dates, and behaviors that could impact future claims. Her diligence was invaluable. With her help, I realized that the battle wasn't personal, it was procedural. The more organized, documented, and patient I was, the more effective the plan would be. Emotionally, I felt a shift too. Gone was the helpless frustration that had plagued me since that text. Anger was still present, yes, but tempered with focus. Each challenge Dylan threw at me became an opportunity to tighten control legally and strategically. I stopped seeing him as an opponent and started seeing the situation as a problem to solve with rules, evidence, and timing. And then, I made a crucial decision. I would stop asking for permission, whether from neighbors, bankers, or even myself. Every rule, every form, every deadline would be followed to the letter. No shortcuts, no negotiations, no appeals to sentiment. Compliance would be mandatory, and enforcement would be inescapable. I could almost feel Dylan sensing the shift. His smirks at dinner conversations were replaced by subtle pauses, the casual defiance slightly tempered. Even without knowing the full extent of my preparations, he had begun to understand, intellectually at least, that I was serious this time. So I stopped asking for permission and started following the rules, every single one. The meticulous planning, the legal safeguards, and the public boundary declaration had transformed the conflict from a chaotic mess into a controllable system. And that's when I knew execution was no longer a question of if, but when. The midpoint was clear. I had moved from reaction to strategy, from frustration to control, from hope to enforceable action. Dylan could rage, argue, or ignore. It didn't matter. The rules, the documentation, and the timeline would speak louder than words. And in that quiet, snow-dusted office, I felt the first real sense of calm in months. March arrived with a cold bite in the Denver air, the kind that makes the streets glisten with frost at dawn. I had reached the point where strategy was no longer theoretical, it was action. I sat at my dining table, papers spread in front of me. Certified letters, bank authorizations, lease clauses, small claims forms, and Rachel's meticulously logged interaction notes. Every step I was about to take had been rehearsed in my mind, measured for legality and impact. Step 1. Serve the certified letters. I double-checked every address, every line of the notices. The letters outlined his obligations clearly: rent, utilities, contributions toward groceries, and deadlines for overdue payments. I delivered them through the U.S. Postal Service with tracking and signature confirmation. No ambiguity, no room for excuses. The moment Dylan signed for those letters, the rules became tangible. Step 2. Formalize the debts. I submitted the small claims filings for unpaid camera loan installments and missed contributions to household expenses. The forms, stamped and filed with the Denver County Clerk, listed exact dates, amounts, and attached copies of receipts and text messages. The clerk gave me a calm nod. "Looks solid," he said, and in that moment, I felt the satisfaction of law firmly on my side. Step 3. Secure financial control. I met with my bank, confirmed updated account authorizations, and placed alerts on any suspicious transactions. Any attempt Dylan made to withdraw funds or access accounts without permission would immediately trigger an official report. The process was methodical, bureaucratic, and utterly lawful. The paperwork alone was enough to make him pause. Meanwhile, I kept Rachel in the loop, directing her to continue recording interactions. She noted every late night, every dismissive comment, and every instance of noncompliance. Her logs were neutral, factual, and, most importantly, admissible if any dispute escalated. The beauty of her involvement was subtle but crucial. A third party, unbiased witness reinforcing that the rules were being enforced fairly. I also made sure to enforce a daily routine that mirrored real life. Morning coffee, quick checks of the mail, business calls, and evening review of documents. Each action was intentional. Each transaction, text, and signature became part of the trail. By the end of the week, I had established an unbroken chain of evidence, ready to be referenced if Dylan tried to argue against the rules. Small, deliberate interactions reinforced the boundaries. When Dylan tried to ignore household chores, I calmly referenced the certified letters and reminded him of consequences. When he attempted to bypass payments, I showed him the small claims filings and the bank notifications. My tone was neutral, my demeanor controlled. Emotion played no role, rules did. Even mundane tasks became part of the strategy. Grocery receipts, utility bills, and rental property records were logged with timestamps. I photographed documents, saved emails, and kept paper copies in a locked folder. Every interaction was documented, every obligation enforceable. By mid-March, I had completed the first phase. Letters delivered, filings submitted, financial access secured, and third-party logs in place. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Dylan reacted predictably. The smirk faded from his face, replaced with tension and subtle attempts to negotiate or distract. But the rules were unyielding. Each step I had executed legally, clearly, and deliberately left him little room to maneuver. My calm resolve, combined with the paperwork trail, meant that his attempts at manipulation were futile. The execution of the plan was not about vengeance, it was about structure, control, and protection. And yet, even in its meticulousness, I could feel the first faint tremor of satisfaction. Boundaries were being respected, my assets secured, and my home finally felt like mine again. Next came the moment I had anticipated for weeks, the apparent victory, and the first taste of pushback that would test the final pieces of my strategy. By early April, it looked like the plan was working. Dylan's behavior had shifted noticeably. He paid partial contributions, cleaned up after himself, and even attempted to apologize. Awkwardly, but still an acknowledgement. I allowed myself a quiet sigh of relief as I sat in my kitchen, coffee warm, sunlight slanting through the blinds. The certified letters had done their job. The small claims filings had established authority. For a brief moment I felt I had won. Yet victory proved fleeting. Started subtly, a missed payment here, a shrug there. Dylan began claiming that certain expenses were unfair or extra, referencing minor ambiguities in the certified letters. It was clear he was probing for weaknesses in the documentation. Then came the calls from neighbors. Someone had overheard him grumbling about Dad being unreasonable, and whispered it to a mutual friend. Word spread in small circles, adding pressure I hadn't anticipated. Rachel called me that evening. Her calm voice carried an edge of concern. "He's escalating," she said. "I've logged every call, every interaction, but he's starting to push back more aggressively." I reviewed the notes. Dylan had begun leaving the house unannounced, showing up at my shop during busy hours, trying to distract me from managing clients and invoices. His timing was deliberate, calculated to create stress and test whether I would bend the rules. Then came the emotional low point. On a Thursday evening, after a long day managing my shop, I found a note slipped under my front door. Short, sharp, and dripping with spite. Asterisk. "You think you can control me? You're going to regret this." Asterisk. My stomach tightened. The rules were working legally, but the emotional toll was growing heavier than I had expected. My calm resolve faced a real test. Adding to the complication, the wild card, my local bank manager, called. Apparently, Dylan had tried to question the legitimacy of the small claims filing, and the bank had received a vague inquiry from an outside source, possibly his lawyer. The bank reassured me they would follow my documented instructions, but the fact that external institutions were now involved created new friction. The apparent victory had suddenly become precarious. The tipping point came during a Saturday morning encounter at the shop. Dylan arrived unannounced, arguing about an alleged overcharge in the grocery log I maintained for household contributions. He raised his voice in front of a client, attempting to embarrass me. The emotional strain of seeing my business professionalism challenged in public made me pause. For a second, I questioned if I could maintain the calm, measured approach I had cultivated for months. And then the first hint of the major reveal appeared. While reviewing my email archives that evening, I stumbled upon a thread from months earlier, before the certified letters and filings. Dylan had been under tremendous personal pressure. Missed photography deadlines, growing debts, and the fear of failing his own goals. That text, "Go die already," was less about me personally and more about his panic and misplaced anger. My initial framing of the conflict as a battle over respect and entitlement was missing a crucial layer, until one line in an old message changed everything. It was a subtle reminder that while Dylan had been irresponsible, his aggression had roots in fear and shame, not outright malice. That realization reframed the entire situation and demanded that my final steps be precise, proportionate, and legally airtight. Emotional catharsis alone wouldn't suffice. I needed to deliver consequences that were indisputable, lawful, and undeniable. The apparent victory had revealed its first cracks. Dylan's resistance, social whispers, and the underlying cause of his anger meant the next phase, major reveal and lawful, clean revenge, would require all my attention, strategy, and patience. It was a rainy Thursday evening in Denver when the full picture finally came into focus. I had been reviewing Dylan's past communications for clarity, piecing together the timeline, and cross-referencing every payment, receipt, and text message. The rain tapped against the kitchen window, a steady, rhythmic reminder that time waits for no one. And there it was, a single line in an email from nearly a year ago that changed everything. Dylan had written to a former client, apologizing for missing deadlines and explaining his financial and personal pressures. He mentioned the overwhelming stress of moving back in with Dad, and, critically, the mounting anxiety from feeling like a failure. In that moment, I realized the outburst. The "go die already" text was not random cruelty. It was a desperate, misguided reaction to his own sense of inadequacy. His anger had been misdirected at me, a convenient target, while the real battle was internal. The second revelation hit me like a punch. One of the receipts I had filed away months ago, a payment Dylan had made toward a minor studio expense, was time-stamped incorrectly in my ledger. Cross-referencing bank records revealed that he had actually tried to contribute more than I initially realized. But the funds had bounced due to an account error outside his control. The neglect wasn't entirely malice. It was circumstance. My meticulous documentation, once a tool for control, now illuminated the truth. Dylan's failure had been both behavioral and situational. I gathered the evidence, the email thread, bank records, receipts, and notes from Rachel, laying them side by side. Patterns emerged. He wasn't trying to harm me. He was floundering under the weight of his own mistakes. Yet, that didn't absolve him of responsibility. It simply reframed the approach I needed. The consequences had to be clear, lawful, and enforceable, but tempered with the understanding of his human struggles. One detail tied it all together: the Cherry Creek lease clause I had referenced in my initial certified letter. Dylan had mocked it, claiming it was irrelevant. But the clause was critical. It legally allowed me to require immediate compliance for overdue contributions. Combined with the bank notifications and small claims filings, it created an unassailable legal structure. Every step I had taken, every document I had prepared, now had a purpose beyond punishment. It was a framework of accountability. This major reveal also connected to the objects I had planted months earlier: the invoices, text threads, and receipts. Each one was a piece of the puzzle, a Chekhov's gun that paid off in understanding both his actions and my lawful options. The meticulous record-keeping that had seemed obsessive now felt prescient. The story wasn't just about control. It was about clarity, responsibility, and enforceable boundaries. Armed with this knowledge, I formulated the final plan. It wasn't about retaliation for the text, nor for the months of frustration. It was about enforcing the rules I had set months ago, but now with full understanding of the underlying dynamics. Certified notices would continue to outline obligations. Small claims filings would proceed, emphasizing overdue contributions, not emotional missteps. Bank access notifications and receipts would stand as irrefutable proof. No one could argue against documented facts. I also prepared for the emotional component. When Dylan realized that his attempts to manipulate or delay consequences were futile, I would be ready to hold space calmly. The legal structure provided leverage. My composure provided clarity. I knew exactly where to stand, both ethically and strategically. By the end of that rainy Thursday, the major reveal had crystallized a truth I hadn't seen at the outset. Dylan's behavior was a mix of human frailty and deflection, not sheer malice. The stakes were unchanged: my home, my finances, my authority, but the approach was now fully informed. I wasn't reacting in anger. I was acting in lawful, methodical clarity. Now I knew exactly where to stand. The next phase, the lawful, clean, and cathartic resolution, was ready to unfold. April had arrived fully, with longer days and a faint warmth in the Denver air. Everything was in place. Certified letters delivered, small claims filings submitted, bank access secured, and Rachel's meticulous logs updated. I was ready to enforce the rules I had set months ago, not out of anger but out of necessity. Dylan needed to confront the consequences of his choices, and the law provided a clean, undeniable path. I started with the small claims hearing. The courthouse, a brick building on Lawrence Street, smelled faintly of coffee and linoleum polish. I arrived early, files in hand, receipts clipped, emails printed. Dylan showed up 30 minutes late, dressed in his usual casual style, a mix of defiance and uncertainty on his face. I calmly greeted him and handed the clerk the documentation, making sure each page was properly indexed. The hearing began, And the judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, asked for a concise presentation. I laid out the facts. The overdue contributions, the unpaid installments for camera equipment, and the supporting bank records and receipts. Each statement was factual, unemotional, precise. No accusations, no dramatics, just evidence. Dylan squirmed slightly in his chair, glancing at the documents, realizing how airtight the case was. The judge listened carefully, nodding as I presented the timeline of interactions and verified receipts. She asked Dylan for his response. He stammered, offered half-hearted explanations, and attempted to minimize the obligations. But the law and the meticulous documentation was undeniable. By the end of the hearing, the ruling was clear. Dylan was required to fulfill the overdue obligations and adhere strictly to the terms outlined in the certified letters. No loopholes, no exceptions. The ruling alone was satisfying, but I also wanted a practical mechanism to ensure compliance. I scheduled automatic payments for his contributions to the household and set alerts for any missed deadlines. Any deviation would trigger notifications to the bank and formal documentation to reinforce accountability. It was legal, structured, and impossible to bypass. Beyond the courtroom, I reinforced boundaries at home. Dylan attempted a casual evening excuse, claiming he was too busy with freelance projects to contribute fully. I calmly referenced the certified letters and reminded him of the small claims judgment. No shouting, no threats, just rules. He hesitated, realizing that his attempts to deflect or manipulate were futile. Emotionally, the experience was cathartic. Months of frustration, stress, and passive endurance were replaced by calm, deliberate control. I no longer feared his outbursts. The adrenaline of confrontation had transformed into quiet confidence. I could finally walk into my home, oversee my business, and live my life without the constant tension of unacknowledged obligations. Rachel continued to assist, logging any interactions, noting minor infractions, and keeping track of payments. Her detailed notes provided a buffer of accountability, reinforcing the legal framework and ensuring that Dylan had no room to argue. Every interaction was now guided by clear, enforceable rules, boundaries backed by law. The final piece of the plan involved subtle public accountability. I sent a certified, factual notice to Dylan's former photography clients, confirming dates, invoices, and obligations for missed assignments. It wasn't punishment, it was simply transparency. No exaggeration, no personal attacks, just verifiable facts. The move reinforced responsibility, ensured fairness to the clients, and prevented Dylan from shifting blame. By mid-April, the ripple effects were evident. Dylan adhered to deadlines, contributed to household bills, and began taking responsibility for his own commitments. He still had work to do on managing personal anxiety, but the law ensured he could no longer deflect or avoid obligations. The boundaries, once ignored, were now enforced with precision and fairness. For me, the payoff was both practical and emotional. I had restored order to my home, secured financial stability, and established a precedent. Rules, when enforced legally, demand respect. Dylan had to confront the tangible consequences of his actions, not through vengeance, but through structured accountability. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, warm cup of coffee in hand, listening to the rain taper off. For the first time in months, the house felt calm. My home, my life, and my authority were restored. Not through anger, but through law, documentation, and firm boundaries. And then came the calls. Notifications from the bank confirmed that automatic payments were processed. Small claims filings were updated with proof of compliance. Even Rachel sent a cheerful message noting Dylan's adherence to household rules for the week. It was the confirmation I had been waiting for. The plan, executed lawfully and meticulously, was working. Finally, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. The journey hadn't been easy. Every step required patience, planning, and restraint. But the result was undeniable. Dylan faced the consequences of his choices. Boundaries were enforced, and peace was restored without a single unlawful act. In that moment, I understood the truth. Revenge, when guided by law and ethics, doesn't need to be cruel to be effective. Structure, documentation, and unwavering adherence to rules can deliver results that emotions alone never could. Next came the smaller ripple effects, the fallout, social adjustments, and the lessons that would linger well beyond the courthouse and kitchen table. By late April, the dust had begun to settle. Dylan was following the rules, contributing consistently, and avoiding the petty manipulations that had defined the previous months. The small claims judgment and certified letters had created a structure he couldn't ignore. Even the bank alerts reinforced accountability, ensuring he adhered to the obligations he had previously tried to avoid. Socially, the fallout was subtle but telling. Friends who had witnessed his earlier defiance noticed the change. Conversations that once carried tension now ran smoother, though awkward glances reminded me that Dylan was still adjusting. I avoided gloating, allowing the law and documentation to speak for themselves. The balance had shifted not through drama, but through enforceable consequences. The practical effects were immediate. Household bills were paid on time, grocery contributions were steady, and the camera studio installments had finally been settled in full. Rachel's logs confirmed compliance for 6 consecutive weeks. Every missed payment or excuse had been replaced by measurable, lawful action. For the first time, I could relax at home without constantly monitoring or reminding him. Even Dylan seemed to absorb the lesson. There was no dramatic confession or apology, just a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement that boundaries now existed and were non-negotiable. The threats, excuses, and impulsive texts had ceased. He was learning accountability in real time, and I could see subtle changes in his posture, tone, and approach. The community and wild card players, the bank, local clients, and neighbors, remained neutral but observant. No one questioned the process because it was rooted in documentation, legality, and fairness. The ripple effect reinforced that lawful consequences command respect without the need for dramatics. The emotional aftermath for me was equally significant. I felt a calm certainty I hadn't known since Dylan's initial outburst. The tension that had plagued every morning, every errand, and every household interaction was gone. My home, my finances, and my authority were secure, and I had achieved it without bending the law or my principles. And just when I thought it was settled, a subtle nudge reminded me that human dynamics never truly end. There would be smaller tests, minor challenges, and quiet adjustments, but this time I was fully prepared to handle them. The foundation was solid. Just when it felt like the tension had fully eased, a quiet but sharp reminder arrived. Dylan, who had been compliant for weeks, called one evening. His tone was different, hesitant, almost nervous. "Hey, I wanted to let you know I applied for a small freelance grant," he said. "But they need confirmation on my living situation and contribution record." My first instinct was caution. Dylan had always tried to skirt accountability, so I prepared to fact-check. But as I reviewed Rachel's logs and the small claims compliance reports, a subtle truth emerged. The very structure I had imposed, the legal and documented boundaries, was now working in his favor too. His adherence to payments, contributions, and obligations created an indisputable record of responsibility. The same measures I had enforced to protect myself were now giving him credibility with external parties. This was twist A. The lawful framework I had built didn't just punish non-compliance. It demonstrated accountability. Dylan's future opportunities, which he had been at risk of losing due to irresponsibility, were now supported by the very evidence I had collected. It was a reminder that lawful revenge, when executed fairly, can have a dual effect, correcting behavior while creating a structured path for redemption. Then came twist B, the quieter, human-centered surprise. Rachel, who had been instrumental in logging interactions and organizing records, revealed she had quietly mediated between Dylan and his freelance clients when minor conflicts arose. Her intervention had prevented potential setbacks and reinforced compliance without me needing to intervene. The wild card had shifted from being a passive recorder to a subtle agent of positive influence, showing me that accountability could coexist with support and guidance. Both twists forced me to reflect on the broader implications of my actions. What I had assumed would be purely punitive now revealed layers I hadn't anticipated. Dylan was learning, adapting, and, in some ways, being set up for success, not by ignoring consequences but by facing them lawfully. My approach had been firm and measured, but it also created a framework for growth. Emotionally, it was a revelation. I realized that revenge doesn't have to be destructive. Legal, documented, and ethical enforcement of boundaries not only ensures compliance but also models responsibility. Dylan's actions, guided by structure and oversight, were transforming him from a careless, impulsive adult into someone who could be trusted to meet obligations, even if begrudgingly at first. The double twist underscored a simple truth. Consequences, when applied consistently and lawfully, don't just punish, they teach. And sometimes, those consequences can benefit the very person who caused the conflict, creating a ripple effect neither party fully anticipates. What I learned wasn't about Dylan or even about legal leverage. It was about the power of structure, fairness, and boundaries. Accountability, when paired with transparency and documentation, can reshape relationships, correct behavior, and still maintain integrity. Sitting in my Denver kitchen one quiet evening, I reflected on everything that had unfolded over the past 6 months. The chaos, the frustration, the shouting, the certified letters, the small claims filings. It had all led to a single, undeniable lesson. My original misbelief that keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries was dead wrong. Boundaries, when enforced fairly and lawfully, are not just protective, they are transformative. I learned that accountability matters more than emotion. Dylan's outburst, the "go die already" text, was shocking, hurtful, and exhausting to endure. But reacting emotionally would have only escalated the tension. Instead, by creating a structured system of lawful consequences, I enforced responsibility without cruelty. Rules backed by documentation, legal authority, and third-party verification hold power far beyond personal anger. I also realized the importance of foresight and preparation. Every receipt, text thread, bank record, and certified letter became a tool. Each one mattered, and when the time came to implement the plan, these details were the difference between frustration and resolution. Planning ahead and documenting actions ensures clarity, fairness, and credibility, qualities that cannot be overstated in any relationship or business scenario. Another takeaway was the dual impact of lawful boundaries. While the primary goal was to enforce compliance and protect my home and finances, the framework I built also created accountability for Dylan. The same documentation that held him responsible also gave him credibility with clients and institutions, subtly encouraging growth. Boundaries, in this sense, are not just walls, they are guideposts. Finally, I saw the value of calm persistence. The temptation to retaliate emotionally or to bend the rules for quick satisfaction was strong. But patience, consistency, and adherence to lawful mechanisms brought a far more satisfying outcome. Dylan faced consequences, respected the rules, and ultimately, our interactions became predictable and secure. That calm, measured approach replaced chaos with clarity. Here's the truth I want to leave you with. Accountability, fairness, and lawful enforcement of boundaries can resolve conflicts without creating enemies. They protect your home, your finances, and your peace of mind while teaching responsibility to others. Emotional satisfaction alone is fleeting. Structured, ethical action produces lasting change. Here's the picture I want you to keep. A house where rules are respected, a parent no longer drained by conflict, and a young adult learning responsibility through law, fairness, and clear boundaries. That image, more than any moment of anger or triumph, defines the lesson. A month later, the house felt different. Same kitchen, same living room, same little garden out front. But the air was lighter. Morning sunlight slanted across the countertops, highlighting the neat stack of receipts and folders. I now kept less out of necessity and more as a reminder of what had been accomplished. Dylan had become quieter, more deliberate, and surprisingly cooperative. I wasn't thrilled about every action he took, but I was no longer in constant tension. That morning, I poured myself coffee, the aroma mingling with faint spring air from the cracked window. Outside, the city hummed. Commuters heading down Broadway, kids biking along sidewalks, neighbors walking dogs. Life moved forward, predictable yet comforting. I glanced at my ledger, saw the small claims filings updated, and realized just how far we'd come. Boundaries, enforced lawfully and patiently, had done their work. Dylan came into the kitchen, tentative, holding a folder. "Here's the confirmation for the freelance grant," he said quietly. I nodded, took it, and filed it. No dramatic apologies, no emotional explosions, just a clear, lawful acknowledgement of responsibility. That small, ordinary exchange felt heavier than any confrontation had. It was a signal that the rules, once enforced, created real structure. I sat back, letting the calm sink in. Months of tension, frustration, and uncertainty had transformed into predictability and security. I realized that revenge, when guided by law, ethics, and documentation, didn't need to humiliate or punish. It simply restored balance. The house was mine, the finances were stable, and Dylan's actions were accountable. Peace was tangible. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, but inside, I had achieved something more important. Clarity, structure, and fairness. No shouting, no threats, just rules, consequences, and accountability. That combination had reshaped the dynamic, and quietly, subtly, it reshaped Dylan too. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.